All right, gentlemen, we are going to start taking a look at Chapter 9 here. Chapter 9 is going to be in two parts, and as we go ahead and look at this, it's important to remember that really what is happening with Chapter 9 is basically a continuation of Chapter 8. Now I think I misspoke last week. Really, the topics of ecology are covered in chapters 4, 5, and 8 as we do it. We skip chapters 6 and 7, which cover different biomes, but we actually see that material in the Planet Earth videos. 8 looks in particular at the study of populations within ecology or within ecosystems. What 9 does is it takes a study of populations that we learn about in 8 and it applies it to human populations and human trends. And it really is its own thing. We call it demographics, and you're going to see that, and we're going to learn about that. But it is the application of everything we hear about populations in Chapter 8 to human populations in particular. So I want to make sure that we have that all laid out. We have here just a list. Here are the different topics that we'll be talking about in this first part of Chapter 9. This is the list of conceptual objectives. These are the questions that you're going to want to be familiar with, at least familiar enough with them in order to be able to answer them clearly and be able to show that you have grasped the concepts within the chapter. Now, in terms of studying human populations, we call this demography or demographics. The book defines this as the study of characteristics of populations, especially human populations. I've never heard the idea of demographics applied to anything but human populations. We generally don't talk about demographics when we're talking about populations of organisms within different ecosystems. So I think it's really appropriate for you guys to associate the word demographics and the concept of demography with human populations and recognize that what we're looking at is the makeup of population, the historical size of populations within countries, specifically so that we can make comparisons, we can understand trends, and ultimately be able to make predictions about those populations. And what we have found is that being able to understand and make predictions of these populations is really important because these have far-reaching consequences in terms of economics and stability within different cultures, within different countries. You guys are a part of demographic studies all the time, whether you know it or not. Certainly, the census itself is a demographic study, something that is laid out in the Constitution. But there's also even more common demographic studies that take place, especially in a developed world that we're in, where buying and selling is such an important part of the economy. Companies are very, very interested in being able to market their product to those who are going to be inclined to buy it. And so advertising and marketing is something that studies and is very interested in demographics, in understanding demographics. So we really see and we understand in terms of demographics that there is literally a daily application. Demographers are not just studying the population, but in particular they're studying the different things that are happening that affect the population and are affected by the population. And so this is where we get our understanding that this is connected to economics and it's connected to social structure, and therefore we put those two together and say it's connected to socioeconomics and things of that nature. In our study of demographics, what we've seen is we've been able to categorize countries into what we call developed and developing countries. And these categories that we have and that we use, these categories are almost exclusively connected to the populations in those countries and the trends, what's happening within those countries and their population. So what we see is we have developed countries, they have higher average incomes, they have slower population growth, which basically means they're having less babies. They have diverse industrial economies, which plays into the fact that they have higher incomes. They have stronger social support systems, which comes from the fact that they have higher incomes and therefore they can tax the people more to pay for the social support systems. Developing countries, on the other hand, are basically, demographically speaking, the complete opposite. They have lower average incomes. They have simple, what we would call agricultural-based economies. That is why they have lower average incomes. And they have rapid population growth, which basically means they're having lots of babies, which historically makes sense in terms of an agricultural-based economy, but they're probably having lots of babies for other reasons as well. When we look at the human population over time, when we take a worldwide historical kind of trend look at population, we see that the mid-1800s is very, very important because it's the first time in human history we see a human population exponential growth or population explosion, where we saw growth rates increasing each and every decade. And when we look at that, we absolutely connect it to the Industrial Revolution, because the Industrial Revolution increased the amount of available food, food production and availability. The Industrial Revolution brought improvements in hygiene, which brought health improvements. So we see those two things really connected to the Industrial Revolution and making a way for the worldwide population, especially where the Industrial Revolution was taking place, to really explode and to take off. There are demographers that have for hundreds of years and today predict that the Earth cannot sustain these populations. It's important to recognize that, much like several other scientific theories and ideas that we've looked at, there are professionals, there are scientists, there are demographers that have a completely opposite view of this. And one of the things we'll see in the video that we watch is that one of the concerns that at least some professional demographers and scientists have is that what we're going to see is a huge population drop. This graph lays this out. You can see between the years of 10,000 and 3,500 BC, the population generally remained steady, well under 1 billion. And as we entered into the age of the empires, that orange line there, you start to see a little bit of an increase, especially as you move into the era of the Greek and then the Roman Empire between 1000 and 0 BC, and certainly we see a jump in population there. And we recognize, especially by the time we get to the Roman Empire, that there was a great increase. Water was made available because of aqueducts, and the empire was so big that there wasn't normal shortages of food. And we see a steady increase from 0 up to about the 1300s or so, with some little dips here and there. The Black Death is mentioned, but at 1850, where we see the green line, we see it's obviously a exponential growth curve, pretty much going straight up. By the year 2000, the population was at like 7 billion, and we see that even today it's between 7 and 8 billion. We study age structures, which is something you're getting into in at least one of your labs so far. And age structure, we define that as the classification of members of a population into groups according to age, the distribution of members of a population in terms of age groups. And age structure is really important because demographers use age structure to make predictions about what's happening and about what's going to happen with the population. We see that countries that have high rates of growth will have more young people than older people. And that is a trend that continues to hold true. And the opposite is that countries that have slow growth or no growth, their age distribution is pretty even, meaning across the board in different age groups, they all have about the same. Now, what we do with age groups is we graph them, as you've seen in the lab, we graph them as population pyramids. And it's a pyramid because what we're really doing is a double-sided bar graph. And it's a double-sided bar graph because in every age group, for example, 5 to 9 year olds, some of that number is going to be made up of males, and some of that number is going to be made up of females. And so it allows us to create bars on either side, which allows us to draw this in the form of a pyramid of certain shapes and sizes. And we've got the diagram that's in your textbook we've got on the next slide, and we'll take a look at that and see the different shaped pyramids that reflect different things that are happening or going on in those age groups. So we see here all the way over to the left is rapid growth, in the middle is slow growth, and all the way over to the right is zero or declining growth. And in rapid growth tends to be the traditional pyramid. It's wider at the base than it is at the top. Okay, and wider at the base. If you look at the age groups are on the left axis, the percentages are on the bottom. Wider at the base means that there is more younger people. So if you look at the rapid growth pyramid and you look at the 0-4 year olds, you have about 9% of the males and about 9% of the females are in that 0 to 4 year old age group in the whole population. That means that your whole population is 18% 0 to 4 year olds. That's a significant number. It is almost 1/5. And notice as you go up into the older years, the percentages become less and less. And this is generally the pyramid that the least developed nations are showing because they're having lots of babies and there's a fairly high death rate at higher ages. The middle pyramid is those nations that are transitional, meaning they are transitioning from being rapid growth into being a zero or declining growth. And notice the transitional nations still have a fairly classic pyramid shape. They're still generally wider at the bottom than they are at the top, and that pretty much follows all the way up. But it's a fatter pyramid. It's shorter and squatter. A lot of those age groups are all going to be around the same percentages. As you move into the zero or declining growth pyramid, which is basically going to be the most developed nations that exist, and you'll see here that's a completely different pyramid. There's more in the middle in the say 35 to 55 age range than there are at the bottom, the younger children. There's a significant amount of older people as well in the 70 and up, 65 and up categories. This represents a country that is not growing. This represents a country that is staying the same in population or declining. And demographers are going to use these pyramids to make future predictions about the countries that create these pyramids. We also talk about survivorship, and that's the percentage of newborn individuals in a population that can be expected to survive to a given age. Survivorship is a part of demographics, which is a long-term study. Most everything in demographics are long-term studies. We don't study demographics by just looking at something 1 year. And it's another way that we make predictions about populations. What demographers do is they take a group of people born at the same time and they basically keep track of how long they live and when they die. So if you have 100 people that are born, you may have a percentage of those that die between 0 and 5. But you're also going to be keeping track of these people, some of them into their 70s, 80s, and 90s. So it's a multi-decade study tool that exists. When we look at survivorship over a long-term study, we will plot and graph what we have, and we're going to create growth curves, so to speak. And basically we get three different types of curves: type 1, type 2, and type 3. Type 1 being the kind that stays closer to 100% longer and then drops off. Type 2, just directly inverse, it's a straight line. And then type 3, you have a lot of death early, and we'll explain what each one of those means as we look at this wealthy developed countries. So in today's economies, Japan and Germany, they're going to have type 1 survivorship because most people live to be very old. You saw that line stayed close to the top for quite some time. Type 2, that diagonal line that goes straight down, that shows similar death rates at all ages. So if your death rate at 0 to 4-year-olds is 20%, your death rate of 20 to 24-year-olds is 20%, so on and so forth. That gives you that straight diagonal line. And then type 3, that is a pattern where you have a lot of offspring die early. Okay, so it starts at 100 and drops off almost immediately and then stays very low. And type 1 and type 3 are the types of survivorship that can result in populations that remain the same size or grow slowly. We also talk about fertility rates, and fertility rate is the number of births per year per 1,000 women of childbearing age. And in terms of demographics, we're going to restrict childbearing age to between 15 and 44. Now, obviously, in terms of biology, physiology, even anecdotally, we know that women can get pregnant before they're 15. We know that they can get pregnant after they're 44. But statistically, the chances really drop off before 15 and after 44. So we consider, demographically speaking, we consider those the childbearing years. And in terms of fertility rate, the main thing that we're looking at here is replacement level. And we define replacement level as the average number of children each parent must have in order to replace themselves. Now, intuitively, we would think that this would be 2, right? Because it takes 2 parents to make a child, and this is about replacing themselves, so you would need to have 2. The problem with that intuitive thinking is that it doesn't take into account that in every society, there's statistically always a number of children that don't survive to a reproductive age. And because of that, mathematically speaking, the replacement level always ends up being a little bit higher than 2. It's not 3, it's less than 2.5, and it does seem odd because you can't talk about people having, 2.5 children or anything like that. But when you take all of the children in the society together and you start doing the math out, it does end up being a decimal. But replacement level ends up being very, very important. We're going to talk about that, and the movie that we're going to watch talks about that significantly. When we look at fertility rates, we can look at this graph on the next slide, and it actually shows the historic fertility rates in the United States. And one of the things that it shows that's very, very important is that in 1970, in the whole history of the United States, 1972 was the first time the fertility rate dropped below the replacement level. And this is where, if you find this type of stuff interesting, demographics can get interesting because demographers are going to start talking about trends in history and why this is happening and what it means for the future. As we've followed these things, we saw that fertility rates remained below the replacement level for most of the 90s up until about 2000, and then it started to jump over, and that's actually my generation was the next generation that came along that started once again having more babies, or at least having babies, beyond that 2 point whatever number. That was the first time since 72 that we had a generation that started doing that. And we look at the graph, and there's not a lot of information on the graph, but our knowledge of history can help us, I think, decipher some of what is going on here in the graph. So we go back to 1920, and we see that the fertility rate was between 3 and 3.5, and stayed up there with some decline through the 30s until you hit about 35, 36, 37, and then it remained low. That fertility rate was right at the replacement number for the second half of the 30s and the first half of the 40s. And if we know anything about American history, we can infer at that point that this has connection to the wars, and in particular World War II, where you had most of the men were away fighting, and the women were home, kind of keeping the home fires burning, so to speak. But that creates a set of circumstances where babies aren't being born. And then you have about 1945-ish, and really between 45 and 65-ish, you have what we have historically referred to as the baby boom. And you can see on the graph, the fertility rate goes up fairly quickly, up to over, and is maintained between 3 and 4 children for a number of years. And this baby boom is directly connected to the fact that the war ended and the men came home, and there was economic prosperity. And so the men had their jobs and they were able to support families, and they came home from being away for a number of years at war. And to be quite simply, and no intentional crassness whatsoever, they started making babies. They started having families, and that continued up through to the mid-60s. And then all those babies that were born in the 40s and 50s grew up, and by the mid-60s they were 15, 20 years old, and that was a whole different generation, a whole different culture. No one was interested by that point in living the conservative life of their parents from the previous decade in the 50s. It was the free sex and free love kind of mentality. People weren't interested in getting married. They weren't interested in having babies. To be quite frank, historically, if they did get pregnant, a lot of times they had abortions. And this leads you right into 1972, which is the first year in the history of America where the fertility rate drops below the replacement rate of 2.2 or whatnot. And historically that's significant because that was also the first year that Roe versus Wade, that was the year Roe versus Wade, the first year that abortion was legalized. That's not a cap. What that shows is that there was a trend, and that trend in the lifestyle and culture of the people came to a head in 72. And from 72 up until 2000, America had a fertility rate that was below the replacement rate. And we should have, and at times we did, but we should have seen huge drops in the population during that time period. We didn't, and we'll talk about that in a bit. But you see on this graph here, it was about 2000. That would have been the year I was getting out of college. So again, my generation, kind of starts the trend back upward to having children above that replacement rate. And that brings us to the discussion about migration, which is any movement of individuals from one location to another. We actually divide migration down into two topics: immigration, which is movement into an area, and emigration, which is movement out of an area. And one of the things we recognize in the modern world is that many developed countries really should have seen a decrease and would have seen a decrease in their populations, except for the fact that they had a lot of immigration taking place. And this is true for America as much as it's true for many other developed nations. So what you have is migration is an important aspect of demographics because it's the movement of people, and it's a significant player in terms of population change. This graph shows, and you can see the difference. The orange top of each bar is increased due to immigration. Not really significant, 50s and 60s. I mean, it's a number there, but a small percentage compared to the increase due to births. Notice, though, in 1980 and through 1990, you have the lowest increase due to births and the highest increase due to immigration. And although from 1990 to 2000 you do see an uptick again, an increase due to births, look how big the bar is for increase due to immigration. So this has played a significant role in the last 30 to 40 years in terms of population trends within, again, developed countries. We also look at declining death rates, and this is huge. Why is it that there was such a dramatic increase in Earth's human population in the last 200 years? One of the reasons is because death rates have declined more rapidly. We have times where the birth rates were pretty low, and we still saw an increase in population. Well, this is because the death rates were declining faster than the birth rates were actually declining. And death rates declining, we tend to not look at these things necessarily correctly in our modern developed world. We think of medical technology and hospitals and all that. Really, death rates decline because of increased access to adequate food, clean water, and safe sewage disposal. As those things happen, you can see life expectancy jump from 35 to 70 just because of those things. So that's really important to keep in mind. The discovery of vaccines in the 20th century also played a role, as it wiped out the causes of what we might consider epidemic deaths. We think of flu epidemics and think of polio and things like that. We also talk about life expectancy, which is the average length of time that an individual is expected to live. And life expectancy is actually most affected by infant mortality, which is the death rate of infants less than a year old. So if you can reduce the death rate of infants less than a year old, you increase the life expectancy, and this is going to have a huge impact on your population trends in that culture. And again, with life expectancy, in particular infant mortality, medical technology is not the most important thing. What's more important is infant health, that we see parents have more education, they have access to food, fuel, and clean water. Those things are so much more important than having a medically technologically advanced hospital on every corner. And we have this graph that shows life expectancy increasing. So the purple line is the least developed nations, and you can see every single type of nation has seen an increase in life expectancy, although there's still disparity. The least developed nations have gone from 35 to 55, but 55 is a lot older than, say, 75, which is where the most developed nations are at. And the most developed nations did not see as much of a jump. They basically went from 67 to 77. But you can see every nation in the world has trended upward in terms of life expectancy. We talk about demographic transition, which really takes us back to looking at those population pyramids. And I don't spend a lot of time covering this in great detail, but as a country undergoes these changes in birth and death rates that are high to lower birth and death rates, we actually see countries are transitioning and moving toward being developed countries as these things take place. And the questions that we ask is, what is happening in a society, especially economically, that would cause a society that has more resources, a developed nation, to have less children and ultimately suffer a population decline. And to look at that, we have to look at the stages of transition. The first stage is a country in pre-industrial condition. Birth rate and death rate are both high, and population ends up being stable, maybe even growing. And then that country moves into a second stage where a population explosion occurs because death rates decline. You start to see hygiene, nutrition, education improve, but during that time birth rates remain high, and so the population grows very, very fast. This moves into the third stage where the population starts to slow, population growth starts to slow because you start to see birth rates decrease. And this population slows down to being stable or zero, but the population is pretty high because of all the growth leading up to it. And then finally, in the fourth stage, birth rate drops below the replacement level, and then you see the size of the population begin to decrease. And this is a 1 to 3 generation process. I wouldn't worry about the graph, it's a little bit complex. But looking at this, what is this? Well, the social trends are connected to women and fertility. And when we see increased education and economic independence for women, when we see those roles changing in a society, we generally see women having less children, or women start to have their children at a later age. And because they start to have their children at a later age, they have less children. So what happens is, and again, demographers are not making a statement. They're not judging the transition. They're talking about the transition. What we'll see in the movie is demographers will judge possibly what the transition means for economic stability in the future, but they're not judging what happens. As women become educated, as they get jobs, as they're not as interested in being at home taking care of kids, women aren't considered, at 18, 19, we're going to start having babies, they're going to go to college. That puts things off for 4 years. Now you're at 21, 22. Are they going to start having babies? Well, no, they're going to go to grad school, or they're going to get a job, and then they're going to work toward, moving up in the company. Whatever the case may be, they don't start thinking about settling down, having families until 28 or 29 or 30. And at that point, if the opportunity is available to them, they're not going to have 3 or 4 kids at that age. They're going to have 1 or 2. And so we see how all this is interconnected. And so what happens is women end up contributing to families' prosperity. They spend less energy bearing and caring for children. But what this means is now that how society views children is different too, because children used to be viewed as an asset. But now, if you've got both parents working and you got to pay for daycare for the children that you do have, when you decide to have them, it's actually pretty common then for society to start to view children as a bit of a financial burden. You hear when I was growing up, even as an adult, even today, you can find all kinds of studies on how much it costs to raise a kid in today's day and age. Well, I don't think people were talking about that, 100 years ago nearly as much. And so you can see where that changed. And if instead of children being viewed as an asset, they're viewed as a financial burden, you're going to see families have less of them as well too. And this contributes to lower birth rates, and we see this in developed and developing countries.